Why did she stay silent? That's what everyone wondered later. Why, after being insulted in front of an entire command center, after being struck in the face, did she just stand there, calm, unshaken, and quiet? At that moment, no one knew who she really was. To them, she was just another bureaucrat, another political appointee sent to observe what she couldn't possibly understand. "Ma'am, the coffee station is over there," Commander Alex Jensen said, his voice slick with condescension. "Try not to spill anything on the million-dollar consoles." A few of the junior officers smirked, nervous, complicit smiles that flickered and died the moment she looked their way. Her expression didn't change. She simply stood there, hands at her sides, her gray eyes fixed on the holographic display that floated in the center of the room. The simulation chamber, dim, circular, and alive with the hum of servers, felt colder than usual that morning. Blue holographic ships hovered above the command table, locked in formation against an incoming swarm of red aggressors. The air smelled of ozone and recycled breath, a sterile world built for the science of war. Jensen, with his polished boots and perfect jawline, strutted around the command ring like he owned it. He was sharp, confident, the kind of officer who'd memorized every manual, every maneuver, every rule that could make him look brilliant in front of a superior. And today, he thought, would be no different. He was leading the fleet through a simulation, a high-level combat exercise designed to test strategic reflexes under pressure. What he didn't know was that someone else was watching more than his tactics, someone who had written the very test he was taking. The woman, slight, unassuming, dressed in plain gray slacks and a simple blue blouse, looked like she'd stepped out of a university library by mistake. Her hair was drawn back in a neat bun, her face bare of makeup, and her posture almost too still. She could have been a scientist, a civilian consultant, anyone but someone who belonged here. When Jensen turned to make a point, gesturing wide for the room to admire his confidence, his elbow caught her square in the cheek. A sharp, careless impact. Not enough to injure, but more than enough to humiliate. A gasp rippled through the back rows. Every technician froze. Every officer's hand hesitated mid-keystroke. Jensen barely noticed. He didn't even look back. To him, it was nothing, an accident at best, an afterthought at worst. He kept talking, eyes locked on the blue and red holographic icons, explaining his next maneuver like a professor who'd never been wrong. But the woman, she didn't move. Her head had snapped to the side from the blow, and now a faint mark bloomed along her cheekbone. Yet instead of touching it, she reached up only to adjust the collar of her blouse, a small, steadying gesture. Then she stood upright again, still silent. Her eyes never left the display. It was that silence, not the insult, not even the strike, that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Because silence has weight. It speaks without permission. And somewhere in the darkened observation deck above, Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne leaned forward. His old eyes narrowed, his instincts stirring. He had seen that kind of composure before, that unnatural calm under pressure that only came from one kind of person, a warrior. Down on the command floor, Jensen paced like a predator in a cage. "Report," he barked. "Tactical, sir. Red Fleet is holding position outside the asteroid belt," replied a young lieutenant. "They're masking numbers with sensor ghosts. Estimate, 3 carrier groups, destroyer and cruiser support." Jensen scoffed. "They're trying to draw us in. Amateur hour. Helm, bring carrier group Alpha to new heading 030 Mark II. We'll flank them through the belt, use magnetic interference to hide our approach. We hit their supply line first." The crew moved with mechanical precision. Orders repeated, commands executed. Jensen radiated certainty, confidence, arrogance dressed as authority. The woman had moved to the far wall near an old decommissioned console, half in shadow. She was a ghost there, watching without interrupting. To Jensen, she was an irritant, a civilian oversight officer, a reminder of bureaucracy meddling in military brilliance. He thought she didn't belong here, and she thought nothing of him at all. When the simulation began, the room came alive with sound. Status reports, range calls, target locks. Blue icons surged across the holographic field, moving exactly as Jensen commanded. And soon, red icons began to die, one after another, vanishing in simulated bursts of light. He smiled. He was winning. Of course he was. From the corner, the woman didn't react. Not a smile, not a frown. Her gaze stayed fixed on the display, calm, analytical, detached, like she'd seen this all before. And maybe she had. When the Red Fleet began to retreat, Jensen's smirk widened. You see, predictable, they're trying to draw us out. They think I'll take the bait. I'll flank them instead. Textbook perfection. He didn't notice how quiet the room had become. He didn't notice that even his crew were glancing at the woman now. Not at her exactly, but at the stillness surrounding her. Something about her silence felt heavy. Like she was watching a slow-motion car crash, one she could stop but chose not to. Then, without warning, the holographic display exploded with crimson alerts. Multiple new contacts, someone shouted. They're coming out of the belt. Jensen frowned. That's impossible. They weren't masking their fleet, the tactical officer stammered. They were masking the mines. On the display, a dense cloud of red proximity icons lit up directly in their path. The simulated fleet was surrounded. Evasive maneuvers, all ships hard to starboard, full impulse. Jensen barked, panic threading into his voice. But it was too late. The belt was a trap, a minefield triggered by active engines and energy signatures. One by one, the blue icons flickered and vanished, destroyed, gone. The Intrepid is gone. The Valiant's venting plasma. We've lost the entire forward destroyer screen. The room dissolved into chaos, panicked voices, alarms, red light flooding the walls. Shut it down, Jensen shouted. Abort the simulation. Sir, we can't, yelled a technician. It's a command-level scenario. It has to play out. Jensen froze. His mouth opened, closed. He looked helpless, and everyone saw it. And that's when she moved. The woman, the silent observer, stepped away from the wall. No hesitation, no rush. Her hands still behind her back, her movements graceful, controlled. One of the junior officers tried to stop her. Ma'am, that's a restricted terminal, you can't. But she didn't argue. She didn't even look at him. She just stepped forward, and somehow he stepped aside. Her presence was magnetic, quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. She took the seat at the secondary command console, a station no one used. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then she began to type. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt. Her fingers danced across the keys, steady, fluid, fast. Lines of code flashed on the display, old systems, obsolete commands no one in the room recognized. She was bypassing everything, cutting straight into the simulation's core. What is she doing? Jensen stammered. The systems administrator leaned closer, whispering. She's accessing the fleet core directly. That's not even in the manual. You can't do that. But she could. She was. On the main display, the surviving blue icons began to slow. Then stop. Engines cold, weapons offline, shields gone. Every ship in Jensen's fleet went dark. What's happening? Jensen's voice cracked. She's shutting them down, someone murmured. She's killing the fleet. But she was. She was saving it. The mines were triggered by energy output, by movement, by heat. By going dark, she'd made the ships invisible. The holographic fleet drifted silently through the minefield, dead, powerless, unseen. And as they drifted, she began recalculating. not using engines but gravity itself. Asteroids, planetary pull, celestial mechanics. She wasn't fighting the simulation. She was rewriting the laws it ran on. The room was silent, except for the soft, rhythmic tapping of her fingers. And for the first time, Jensen, the loudest man in the room, said nothing. When the last blue icon cleared the minefield, the technicians exhaled in collective awe. She'd saved half the fleet, in a scenario designed for total destruction. She stepped back from the console, hands folded again behind her back. Her cheek still bore the faint red mark. And only now did she look directly at Commander Jensen. Her eyes met his calm, gray, unreadable. There was no anger, no triumph, no need for either. He whispered, "That's not possible." Up above, Admiral Thorne stood, slowly, a knowing smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. He'd seen that stillness before, that precision, that mind. And in that instant, he knew exactly who she was. He leaned toward his aide. "Get me her file now." The aide hesitated, eyes wide. "Sir, you mean?" "Yes," Thorne said softly, "the architect." He didn't hurry. Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne didn't need to. When a man like him stood, the room itself seemed to stand still. From the darkened observation deck above, his boots echoed against metal grating, deliberate, measured steps that carried the weight of 4 decades of command. Every officer below could feel it, the shift in gravity that comes when authority enters the room. Thorne's gaze never left the woman. She stood there near the silent console, a faint glow from the holographic display painting her face in soft blue light. Still, calm, waiting. He'd seen composure before, in snipers who'd lost entire platoons and still finished the mission, in pilots guiding burning aircraft to safe landings. But this was something else. This was serenity forged from absolute mastery. Jensen didn't notice Thorne yet. He was too busy staring at her, the woman he'd mocked, elbowed, dismissed. His confidence was gone, replaced by disbelief and a growing, icy fear that he couldn't yet name. What did you do?" he stammered. "You overrode the system, that's not even." The woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was a verdict. Then a voice cut through the charged air, deep, commanding, precise. "Commander Jensen." Every head turned. The Admiral's voice came from above, firm as steel and sharp as thunder. "Stand down." Jensen froze, his stomach plummeted. He looked up, saw the silhouette descending the spiral stairs, metals catching the light. "Admiral Thorne, sir, I—" "Save it." Thorne's tone wasn't loud, but it carried absolute control. The kind of voice that didn't need to shout, because it had been obeyed in battlefields where shouting meant death. The entire room straightened. No one dared breathe too loud. Thorne reached the command floor. He didn't look at Jensen. He walked straight past him toward her. Up close, the contrast between them was striking. The towering admiral in full uniform, ribbons like constellations across his chest, and the woman before him, dressed in civilian gray, no insignia, no rank visible, no expression on her face. He stopped 2 feet away, studied her quietly. The faint red mark on her cheek caught the light. His jaw tightened. His aide, a young captain, rushed forward with a data slate. "Sir, the file you requested." Thorne didn't take his eyes off her. He simply extended his hand, eyes still fixed as he read the screen. A second later, his entire expression changed. Respect, recognition, awe. And then, slowly, to the shock of every single person in that room, Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne straightened to full attention and raised his hand in salute. "Admiral Hayes," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "My apologies for the state of this exercise. I was not aware you would be personally gracing us today, ma'am." The words fell like a thunderclap. "Admiral. Not liaison. not civilian observer. Admiral. The title hung in the air, impossible electric. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one even blinked. Then Jensen's world began to tilt. His throat went dry. His mind refused to process what he just heard. Admiral. He turned toward her, the same woman he'd called a bureaucrat, the same woman he'd struck across the face, the same woman who had just saved his fleet with a maneuver no one else could even comprehend. No, he thought, no, that's not. But it was. The aide stepped forward again, projecting her personnel file onto the main holographic display. And there it was, her name glowing against the dark. HAYES.ORIGIN, rank Admiral. Unit, Office of Naval Intelligence, Advanced War Gaming Directorate. Her file scrolled downward, line after line of commendations, medals, and classified achievements. Architect of Project Kobayashi Maru III. Designer of Operation Silent Talon, the strategy that ended the Orion standoff without a single shot fired. Recipient of the Navy Cross. Distinguished Service Medal, 3 gold stars. Half the document was redacted, entire missions blacked out, strings of text replaced with encrypted markings. And then came the final line. Call sign, THE Architect. The air itself seemed to vanish from the room. Every officer, every technician, every enlisted soul froze as if turned to stone. The Architect. They'd all heard the name whispered across mess halls, cited in lectures, used in cautionary tales at the academy. The Architect was a legend, a strategist whose simulations were so complex they bordered on impossible. Rumor said the Architect's tests weren't designed to be won, they were designed to reveal, to expose what a commander was really made of. Until now, no one had ever seen the Architect. No one had imagined that the ghost behind the Navy's most infamous trials was a woman. And certainly not this woman. Thorne lowered his salute, but the reverence in his posture remained. He turned slowly toward the pale, shaking commander beside him. Commander Jensen, he said, his voice calm, almost too calm, do you know what this means? Jensen couldn't answer. His mouth opened, but no words came. Thorne continued, each word deliberate, a scalpel cutting through silence. Admiral Hayes is the mind behind this simulation. She wrote the code for this very scenario before you ever set foot in uniform. That maneuver she performed, the dead stick gravitational drift, it's not in the manual because she invented it. We call it the Hayes maneuver, classified, level 6 clearance. He took one step closer to Jensen, eyes hard. She wasn't observing this exercise, Commander. She was auditing it. The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared to move. No one dared to look away. And you, Thorne's voice dropped, the words cutting like glass, you failed. You failed the test of strategy. You failed the test of leadership, but most of all. He paused, his eyes flicked to the red mark on her cheek. You failed the test of character. Jensen's knees locked, his pulse roared in his ears. Thorne stepped even closer, his tone low, dangerous. You judged a book by its cover, and in doing so you have brought shame upon yourself and upon this command. The Admiral's finger pointed toward the fatting mark on Evelyn Hayes's cheek. And then you dared to put your hands on her. The room's silence turned suffocating. No one exhaled. In the rigid order of military hierarchy there are mistakes, and then there are unforgivable acts. Striking a superior officer, let alone an admiral, wasn't a disciplinary issue. It was career death. And he hadn't just struck any admiral, he'd struck her. The Architect. A living legend. Jensen's body trembled. He tried to speak, but his throat betrayed him. Sir, it was an accident, I didn't know. Thorne's gaze didn't soften. You didn't ask. That hit harder than any reprimand. The woman, Admiral Evelyn Hayes, finally moved. Just a small gesture, a slight nod toward Thorne, subtle and calm. Permission granted. The conversation in her eyes was over. Her composure remained absolute. Her silence, once mistaken for weakness, was now something far more commanding. It was the silence of someone who didn't need to defend herself. Someone who'd already won. Thorne turned back to her, his voice gentler now. "Ma'am, your presence here today, it honors us." She inclined her head once, neither proud nor dismissive, simply factual. Then she looked at Jensen, and for the briefest moment something softened behind those gray eyes. Not pity, not anger, something closer to quiet disappointment. And somehow that was worse than any punishment. Without another word, she turned and walked away from the console. Her steps were measured, light, unhurried. No one followed her, no one spoke. The door slid open with a hydraulic sigh, and she disappeared into the light beyond, leaving the room she had just transformed in total, reverent silence. Up above, Admiral Thorne exhaled slowly. His eyes followed her until the door closed. Then softly, he said to his aide, "Do you understand now why I said she was rare?" The aide nodded wordlessly. "Admiral Hayes," Thorne continued, "isn't just brilliant, she's disciplined, silent, exacting, the kind of leader this service doesn't deserve often enough." He looked back at Jensen, whose face was still white, his body rigid, trembling beneath the weight of humiliation. Thorne's tone hardened again. "Commander Jensen, effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending review. You will await orders from the Office of Naval Intelligence, and you will remember this day not as punishment but as education." He turned away, leaving the stunned room in frozen stillness. The woman had come and gone in under an hour, but the echo of her presence would last years. Around the consoles, young officers exchanged glances. They'd all seen arrogance before, they'd all tolerated it, laughed at it, admired it even. But today they'd witnessed something different, something truer. Competence, quiet, unflinching, undeniable, had walked into their lives and redrawn the definition of strength. As Jensen stood alone in the fading blue light, he felt the enormity of what he'd done settle on him. Not just the physical act, but everything that had come before it, the smirk, the mockery, the assumption. He thought of the woman's silence. How it hadn't been fear, it hadn't been submission. It had been control. And for the first time in his life, he realized that silence could be louder than shouting, and far, far more powerful. He lowered his head. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Up on the observation deck, Thorne lingered by the railing, watching him. Then, to no one in particular, he murmured, "Sometimes the universe doesn't shout its lessons. Sometimes it just elbows you in the face." He let out a weary sigh. "But if you're lucky, you learn before it breaks you." The lights dimmed as the simulation shut down. The holographic fleet faded into darkness. And in that silence, heavy, reflective, eternal, one legend ended her lesson, while another began to learn it. For a long time after she left, no one spoke. Not the technicians, not the officers, not even Admiral Thorne. It was as if sound itself had been stripped from the air, like the room was afraid to move, afraid to break whatever invisible truth had just settled there. The holographic starfield flickered one last time, then vanished, leaving only the cold hum of the servers. And in that vacuum, the only thing louder than the silence was realization. They had all witnessed something they would never forget. A single careless moment had revealed the difference between arrogance and authority, between command and comprehension. Commander Jensen, once the loudest man in any room, stood perfectly still. He could still feel the faint echo of her gaze, the way she'd looked at him with that quiet, devastating calm. No rage, no satisfaction, just a steady mirror that forced him to see himself. He would never forget that look. When Admiral Thorne finally spoke, his voice was low, measured. "End simulation." A chorus of soft beeps followed, lights dimmed, consoles powered down. Thorne turned to his aide. "Seal this session, full classification, no external reports." "Yes, sir." He didn't need to explain why. Some stories weren't meant for files or official logs. Some stories lived better as whispers. Jensen stood at attention, his breathing uneven. He wanted to apologize, to speak, to somehow undo the weight crushing his chest, but there was no protocol for what he'd done. There were no words heavy enough to carry the meaning. Thorne didn't look at him. He just said quietly, "You'll receive orders in the morning, dismissed." It wasn't a punishment. Not yet. But Jensen knew what it meant. The next day the story began to move, not through reports, not through memos, but through people. It started in the lowest ranks. A technician who'd seen everything told a friend on another ship. The story jumped systems, traveled through encrypted channels and late-night comm calls. And as it spread, it grew. In every retelling, there was a little more myth, a little more awe. But the core remained pure, untouched. A commander had mocked a quiet woman. He elbowed her in the face. And she turned out to be Admiral Evelyn Hayes, the legendary architect, the mind behind the Navy's most complex simulations, the strategist whose designs broke egos more often than they tested skill. By the time the story reached the outer fleets, it had become a parable. A whisper shared in training halls, in barracks, in the quiet hum of engine rooms. They called it the Hayes incident. And in every version, one message stayed the same. Never mistake silence for weakness. Meanwhile, far from the rumors, Commander Jensen reported for reassignment. He expected humiliation, a court-martial, perhaps, or a career-ending transfer to some forgotten asteroid base. Instead, the orders surprised him. He wasn't banished. He was reassigned to the Naval War College Library. At first, he thought it was mockery, a punishment wrapped in irony. But the message attached to his orders was short and clear, signed by Admiral Thorne himself. "Some lessons are not learned on the bridge, Commander. They are learned in silence." The library was nothing like the command center. No flashing consoles, no barking orders, no adrenaline. Just the soft rustle of pages, the glow of old monitors, and the steady hum of climate control preserving decades of doctrine. And there, in a small research alcove beneath the old War Studies wing, Jensen found his new assignment. A sealed collection. Dozens of thick, digital volumes marked with a single name. HAYES, Strategic TRESES Classified. He opened the first one reluctantly. Then another. And another. At first he read out of obligation, then curiosity, then hunger. Each paper was a revelation, not of technical genius alone, but of something deeper, a philosophy, a moral discipline. Admiral Hayes didn't write about how to win wars. She wrote about how to understand them, how to think, how to anticipate, how to preserve what mattered. Her tone was precise, almost mathematical, yet filled with humanity. She wrote of restraint, of patience, of humility as a weapon sharper than pride. One line stood out to him early on, and he read it over and over again. "The quietest rooms often hold the loudest truths. Listen before you speak, think before you act, and you will hear what arrogance cannot." He sat there for hours, reading, until his eyes burned and the ache behind his temples turned into something unfamiliar, clarity. The same clarity she had shown that day in the simulation. The same calm. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Every morning, he arrived before the library lights came on. He would sit in the same chair, surrounded by shelves of tactical brilliance, and read her words like scripture. He wasn't just serving a punishment anymore. He was becoming a student. The other officers began to notice. At first they mocked him, the fallen golden boy, buried in books. But then they saw the change. His posture softened, his temper faded. He began asking questions, not to argue but to understand. He spoke less, listened more. And slowly the sneers turned to respect. He had been stripped of command, but he was regaining something more valuable: character. Meanwhile, beyond the War College, the Hayes incident continued to ripple through the fleet. It wasn't official doctrine, not yet, but it was everywhere. In the mess halls, sailors whispered, "Did you hear about the architect?" On carrier bridges, officers muttered reminders before briefings, "Don't pull a Jensen." And when someone quiet, a young analyst, a communications tech, a junior pilot displayed unexpected brilliance, the crew would say with a grin, "She went full Hayes." It became part of their culture, a moral shorthand. And though Admiral Hayes herself said nothing, issued no statements, gave no interviews, made no speeches, her silence spoke for her. She didn't need to defend herself or punish anyone. The universe had done that for her. Admiral Thorne saw it happen, the way her legend spread like gravity, unseen but inescapable. One evening, long after the command center had emptied, he stood before that same secondary console, the one she'd used. The technicians had roped it off with a strip of velvet. No one had ordered them to. They just did it. A single image was taped to the monitor. A grainy still from the security feed. It showed a woman with her hair tied back, her cheek marked faintly red, her hands steady above the keys. The glow of the screen reflected in her eyes. Beneath the image, someone had written one word in marker: precision. Thorne stared at it for a long time. He thought of how rare she was, not because of her brilliance, but because of her restraint. She had every right to destroy Jensen's career, but she didn't. That restraint, he realized, was the mark of true power. As the months passed, Jensen's transformation deepened. He no longer sought command. He sought comprehension. And in that pursuit, he found something close to peace. One day, as he sat in the quiet of the library, an envelope arrived, hand-delivered, sealed with the insignia of the fleet command. Inside was a single-page letter. It read, "To Captain-Select Jensen, your work compiling Admiral Hayes's tactical treatises has been exemplary. You have demonstrated reflection, humility, and growth. The measure of a leader is not how loudly they command, but how deeply they learn. Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne." At the bottom, a postscript: "I trust you understand now what she was teaching you." He did. And in that moment, sitting alone beneath the humming lights of the archives, Jensen felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not satisfaction, but quiet dignity. For the first time, he understood what Admiral Hayes had shown them all. That strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It simply is. Far above the Earth, on the orbiting Naval Intelligence Directorate, Admiral Evelyn Hayes continued her work, designing new simulations, drafting new doctrines, teaching without ever entering a classroom. She didn't need recognition. Her influence had already taken root in 1,000 unseen ways, in the tone of new officers, in the silence before decisions, in the careful pause of a commander before issuing an order. Her legacy was alive, and it didn't wear her name. It wore her discipline, her silence, her precision. The legend grew quietly, like all truths worth keeping. Months after the incident, the Navy's official databases still held no mention of Admiral Evelyn Hayes's unexpected appearance in the Fleet Command Simulation Center. No reports, no memos, nothing. It was as if it had never happened. And yet everyone knew. The story traveled the way truth always does, through whispers, late-night retellings, and the quiet reverence of those who had been there. It became a current beneath the steel decks and carrier hangars, moving from one fleet to another, from the lowest technician to the highest-ranking officer. Each time someone said, "the architect," the room seemed to pause for half a heartbeat. By the time a new crop of ensigns arrived at the academy, the tale was already legend. They learned about tactics, orbital mechanics, and command ethics. But the real lesson didn't come from textbooks. It came from the hushed voice of a senior instructor who would lean in during lectures and say, "Remember Admiral Hayes. Remember what happens when pride outruns respect." The instructor never said her name loudly. It wasn't needed. The cadets would nod, wide-eyed, because by then everyone had heard some version of what had happened. The commander who struck a quiet woman and the admiral who answered not with anger, but with impossible genius. Commander Jensen, no, Captain Jensen now, lived with that story in silence. His promotion hadn't come from power or politics. It had come from humility. From the long months he spent buried in the library, dissecting every word Hayes had ever written. He stopped chasing rank, stopped chasing the illusion of control. Instead, he began teaching. The Navy War College assigned him to lead a new seminar on adaptive command ethics. It wasn't flashy. No one fought for the post, but those who attended his classes left different from how they entered. He spoke softly now, without theatrics. His voice carried weight not from authority but from experience. He never mentioned the incident, never said her name. He didn't have to. The story sat like a ghost in the back of every lesson. When students grew too eager to prove their brilliance, he'd pause and say only this: "Sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one who doesn't need to speak." He'd let that silence hang, and the cadets would shift uneasily in their seats, feeling the truth of it without understanding its source. The Navy itself began to change in subtle ways. In debriefs, officers started to listen longer. Commanders learned to ask instead of assume. And somewhere in the folds of official doctrine, a new principle appeared, anonymous in origin, uncredited in the index. Competence commands itself. It spread like quiet scripture. Across the fleet, a new phrase entered common use: "Don't pull a Jensen." It meant don't underestimate the quiet one. Don't mistake stillness for ignorance. And when someone accomplished something extraordinary, something measured, precise, and without fanfare, they'd say, smiling, "That was full Hayes." A culture was shifting, and no one could quite pinpoint when it began. But those who'd been in the command center that day, they knew. They'd seen what real power looked like. Admiral Hayes, meanwhile, receded even further from public sight. She returned to her work at the Office of Naval Intelligence, buried under layers of clearance and code names. Her simulations became even more sophisticated, stripping away predictability, forcing officers to think in new dimensions, to fail gracefully, not loudly. She didn't attend ceremonies. She didn't grant interviews. She rarely left her workspace aboard the ONI station orbiting Titan. Her world was made of code, mathematics, and the hum of starfield projectors. And yet her influence filled every deck of every ship. In one exercise, a destroyer's young tactical officer faced an unexpected systems collapse. Her superior panicked, demanding full power and weapons online. But the officer remembered a story, one she'd heard in the academy. A woman, a console, and a silent solution. Instead of following panic, she went still, ordered a complete power down, drifted. The minefield detonations missed them by kilometers. They survived. When they reported their actions, the admiral reviewing the case simply smiled. That, she said, was the Hayes maneuver. Back on Earth, the War College kept a quiet monument, unofficial but untouchable. In a corner of the old simulation wing stood the secondary console she had used that day. Someone had cordoned it off with a velvet rope. No order had ever been given. It just stayed that way. Above it hung the photograph, the grainy still from the security feed. Evelyn Hayes illuminated by a blue glow, eyes calm, cheek marked faintly red. Beneath it, one word etched into a brass plate. Precision. Students would stop there sometimes, midnight before exams, alone in the dark corridor. They'd stare at the photograph and wonder what it meant to command without shouting, to hold power without needing to prove it. No one ever touched the console. It had become a kind of shrine, not to victory but to mastery. One night long after the halls had emptied, Captain Jensen stood before that same image. The light above it flickered, faint and gold. He reached up, his hand trembling, tracing the edge of the plaque without touching it. He whispered, "I'm still learning, ma'am." Then quietly he saluted. He didn't see the other figure at the end of the hallway, Fleet Admiral Thorne, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, a faint smile ghosting across his face. He waited until Jensen left before stepping forward, gazing at the same photograph. "You were right," he murmured. "He did learn." He let out a breath and turned away. They all did. Far away, aboard the orbital ONI headquarters, Admiral Hayes sat alone in her private suite, lights low, data screens humming softly. Outside her viewport stretched the cold beauty of Saturn's rings, endless and silent. Her hands rested on a tablet filled with new simulation designs. She paused halfway through typing, her reflection caught faintly in the glass. Years had passed since that day in the simulation chamber, but she remembered it with perfect clarity. The sound of Jensen's words, the sting of his elbow, the eyes of the room when she took control. She remembered none of it with anger. In her mind, it was never about humiliation. It had been about revelation. She had not sought to punish him, she had sought to teach. Because arrogance could be crushed by punishment, but only humility could rebuild what arrogance destroyed. And that, she believed, was the true work of leadership. She looked out toward the planet below. Its storms churned in slow, majestic silence. Her reflection hovered against that vastness, a small, human figure in the face of immensity. "Sometimes," she whispered to the empty room, "dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." Her console chimed, a message appeared. From Fleet Admiral THORNE. Subject: Case Study, Epsilon AERODANI System Incident. She opened it. The attached report detailed a real-world operation. A destroyer squadron caught in an ambush, engines dead, energy systems offline. The commanding officer, a young woman, had ordered her fleet to go dark, using gravitational drift to escape the trap. Saved over 3,000 lives. At the bottom of the report, one line glowed in gold font. Dynamic Inertial Coasting Procedure, colloquial name, the Hayes Maneuver. Evelyn Hayes leaned back in her chair. For a long while she said nothing. Then softly a smile broke across her face, the kind that held no pride, only quiet gratitude. She whispered, "Good, they're listening now." When dawn rose over the War College on Earth, the young cadets in their pressed uniforms filed into the lecture halls. On every desk sat a small handbook, required reading for all command track officers. Its title was plain: Ethics of Command Under Uncertainty. No author name, no preface, no acknowledgement. But in the back, on the final page in fine print, were 3 words: For those who lead quietly. It was hers, it had always been hers. And as the sunlight spread across the academy courtyard, catching the brass letters of her silent plaque, the whispers began again. New voices, new generations. Some stories never fade, they simply change uniforms. And somewhere between silence and strength, between humility and command, the legend of Admiral Evelyn Hayes lived on, not as rumor, not as reprimand, but as guidance. A living current through the Navy's heart. Invisible, enduring, unbreakable. because true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It leaves proof instead. And that proof, etched not in metals but in minds, was her lasting victory. Years later, the legend stopped being a story. It became a standard. Every fleet, every command deck, every tactical briefing carried her presence like a quiet code written between the lines. There were no statues, no songs, no medals in her name, only a discipline, a certain silence before decisions, a gravity that no one questioned anymore. Admiral Evelyn Hayes had become something more than a person. She was now a principle. Out beyond the outer colonies, in the cold edges of mapped space, a destroyer squadron patrolled the Epsilon Aerodani sector. The region was known for volatile magnetic storms and uncharted debris fields, but tonight the sensors were clear. The fleet drifted in formation under the faint glow of a dying sun. The squadron commander, a young woman named Lyra Vaughn, stood at the bridge viewport, her hands clasped behind her back. She was calm, focused, her uniform crisp, her voice always measured. She earned her command at 29, not because of who she knew, but because of what she understood. She had been a cadet when she first heard the story of the architect. To her it had sounded like a myth, the kind of tale that instructors used to scare arrogance out of the overconfident. But she'd never forgotten it, especially one line: "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." It became her quiet mantra. Now, years later, standing in the silence of her own command bridge, she found herself remembering those words. "Captain," her tactical officer called out, breaking the stillness. "We're picking up a distortion on the long-range sensors. Could be magnetic interference, could be artificial." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Source: Bearing 225. Weak at first, but it's growing stronger. Too regular to be natural." She turned to her navigator. "Plot course, keep us at half thrust. No active scans, passive observation only." Her crew obeyed, moving with disciplined precision. The destroyer slipped through the black like a shadow, its lights dimmed, hull gliding against the faint starlight. Then, without warning, every console on the bridge flickered. "Captain, engine output dropping. Power fluctuation, control systems unresponsive." "Ma'am, we're losing shields." The hum of the ship's core stuttered once, then died. The lights faded to emergency red. "What the hell just happened?" her first officer shouted. "Diagnostics offline. We've lost propulsion, weapons, everything." "EMP?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "No, ma'am, it's not natural, some kind of signal interference. It's targeted, adaptive." They'd been ambushed. And not by anything human. Outside the viewport, the void shimmered and shapes began to emerge. Sleek, angular, silent, unknown vessels, a dozen of them, maybe more. Alien signatures that the database didn't recognize. Her communications officer looked up, pale. "They're broadcasting something. It's not a language, it's a modulation. Looks like they're disabling us remotely." "Orders, Captain?" her XO asked. "We can't fight them like this. We're sitting ducks." Lyra exhaled slowly. Around her, panic began to ripple through the bridge, the same kind of panic she'd seen in the eyes of young officers during her academy simulations. She felt it too, rising in her chest, that instinct to do something, anything. But then she remembered the story. The simulation, the silent woman, the mark on her cheek. The moment she'd made every ship in the fleet go dark. "Power down everything," Lyra said softly. Her XO blinked. "Ma'am." "You heard me, everything. Life support to minimum. No engines, no signals, make us a ghost." "Captain, that's suicide. We'll drift." "Do it," she said, her tone firm, calm, absolute. One by one, the ship systems shut down. The bridge went quiet except for the low emergency hum. The stars outside grew sharper, the glass clearing as internal lights dimmed. Then, for the first time since the ambush began, the alien vessel stopped moving. They hovered in silence, scanning, searching, but the human ships were gone from their senses, hidden by their own stillness. Lyra didn't move. She stood at the viewport, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the enemy that could no longer see them. Minutes passed, then 10, then 30. The alien ships began to drift away, fading back into the darkness like predators losing interest in motionless prey. Only when they were gone did she whisper, "Now, navigation, bring us around using drift vectors. Plot a course home using gravitational currents." Her navigator hesitated, then nodded, "Yes, ma'am." And with faint bursts from the auxiliary thrusters, manual only, unpowered between adjustments, the destroyer squadron began to move. Slow, silent, alive. Hours later, the fleet emerged from the storm, battered, scarred, but intact. 3,000 lives saved. And when Earth Command received the report, they didn't call it luck. They called it by another name. The Hayes Maneuver. When Admiral Thorne read the debrief, he smiled quietly. He was old now, retired from active command, his medals boxed in a drawer, his days spent advising younger officers. But this was different. He opened the attached file, and there it was. The procedure name, the survival logs, the flight data, everything that proved her legacy lived on in action, not words. He forwarded the report to one recipient only. To Admiral Evlyn Hayes. From ARCHITECT.PROTOCOL. Subject, they RMMBRD. That night on the ONI station, Evelyn Hayes read the message. She sat alone in her office, her reflection pale in the screen's glow. She didn't reply, she didn't have to. Her silence said everything. She rose, walked to the viewport, and watched the stars drift by. In their faint movements, she saw her own design reflected, a galaxy governed not by noise but by balance. Behind her, the hum of the simulation engines pulsed softly. Dozens of officers, young and eager, were running her newest scenarios, tests of restraint, perception, patience. They didn't know she was watching. She preferred it that way. Each time one of them hesitated instead of reacting, she smiled faintly. They were learning. Back at the Naval War College, Captain Jensen stood in front of a new class of recruits. The hall was full, young faces, restless hands, eyes full of ambition. He began his lecture the same way he always did, not with a quote, not with a story, but with a question. "What do you think power sounds like?" A few cadets murmured answers. "Authority. Command. Control. Volume." He shook his head, "No." He paused, scanning the room. "Power doesn't shout," he said softly. "It listens, it observes, it understands. When the time comes to act, it doesn't need to prove itself." He looked down at his notes, where a faded photo of a woman with gray eyes was clipped to the corner. "Sometimes," he continued, "the loudest lesson in your life won't be the one someone teaches you. It'll be the one you earn the hard way." He smiled faintly, closing the folder. Class dismissed. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across the War College courtyard. The brass plaque beneath the roped-off console glinted in the light. Students passed by, some pausing to read the single word carved there. Precision. No one remembered exactly who had put it there. No one needed to, because the lesson behind it had already shaped everything they were becoming. And somewhere beyond the stars, Admiral Hayes, the architect, kept working in silence, guiding them still. Not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as a living current moving through every quiet act of competence, every restrained decision, every officer who learned to lead not with noise, but with grace. True command, she had always believed, didn't demand attention. It earned it. And so, through the endless hum of space and the whispered stories of those who came after, her voice carried on, not in words, but in the steady rhythm of those who finally understood. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Time has a way of softening everything except truth. Years turned quietly into decades, and the fleets that once whispered her name became filled with officers who had never seen her face. The legends persisted, reshaped and retold, but beneath the embellishments, one unshakable truth remained. Admiral Evelyn Hayes had changed the Navy. Not through revolution, not through defiance, through example. She retired quietly, as everyone knew she would. No ceremony, no farewell speech, just a brief message circulated through internal channels. Effective immediately, Admiral Hayes will step down from active duty. Her contributions to naval operations, ethics, and simulation design are classified and enduring. That was it, no fanfare, no headlines. When the message reached the fleet, a silence followed it, different from mourning but heavier than respect. It was the silence of acknowledgement, of collective gratitude from those who knew what her name meant, even if they couldn't explain it. Inside her small study overlooking the quiet coastal waters of Maine, Evelyn Hayes sat surrounded by boxes of files and data drives. Her medals remained sealed in their cases, untouched for years. The room was sparse, functional, ordered, like her mind had always been. A single framed photograph sat on her desk. It wasn't of ships or admirals or ceremonies. It was of her old war college team, smiling awkwardly after a failed simulation decades ago. They had been so young, so sure of themselves. She had been too. She touched the glass, her fingers trembling just slightly. Failure, she whispered to herself, was always the better teacher. Outside, gulls cried above the waves. The wind pressed softly against her window. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the ocean, but to the quiet. The same kind of quiet that had always guided her. News of her retirement reached Captain Jensen within the week. He sat in his office at the War College, now older, grayer, but steady as ever. When he saw the notice, he didn't speak. He simply stood, straightened his uniform, and looked at the photograph above his desk, the same one that hung beside the old simulation console. Her eyes looked back at him, calm as ever. He raised a hand in salute, just once, the same way Admiral Thorne had all those years ago. And in that moment, he realized something. He had spent most of his life trying to understand her. Now, at last, he did. She hadn't been teaching tactics. She'd been teaching grace. The kind that can only exist in silence. 2 years later, the Navy received the news everyone knew would eventually come. It wasn't announced with trumpets or ceremonies, just a quiet message in the fleet network, marked with a single line of text. Admiral Evelyn Hayes deceased, age 81. Service record exemplary, status immortalized. For hours afterward, the network stayed unusually still. No new transmissions, no chatter. Just silence. Across every deck and every command center, people stopped for a moment. Some whispered her name. Others simply looked at the stars and said nothing at all. At the War College, cadets gathered in the main atrium. They didn't know her personally, but they'd grown up on her doctrine, had trained under her principles. The old plaque under the roped console gleamed in the dim light, the single word on it almost glowing. Precision. A student asked softly, who was she really? Captain Jensen, now Admiral Jensen, stood nearby, listening. He stepped forward, his voice low and even. She was the reminder that strength doesn't need witnesses, he said. That control isn't noise, it's choice. And that respect isn't commanded, it's earned quietly, through what you do when no one's watching. He glanced at the console and smiled faintly. She taught us that leadership isn't volume, it's clarity. The cadets listened in stillness. They didn't take notes. They didn't record. They just watched him and understood something wordless. Later that evening, a ceremony took place. Not official, not recorded, but real. Every ship in the fleet powered down for 30 seconds. No engine, no transmissions, no lights. Only the stars remained, reflected against silent hulls drifting through space. For 30 seconds, the galaxy itself seemed to honor her in the only language she had ever spoken: silence. Then one by one the systems came back online. The lights returned. The hum of power resumed, but something invisible had changed. From that day forward, every officer's oath added one unspoken clause: lead with clarity, command with humility, act with precision. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. In time, the Navy would dedicate a small training center in her name, a modest structure on the coast where the sea met the forest. It wasn't grand or guarded, just a place where cadets came to think, to learn, to fail. Above its entrance, carved into stone, were the words she'd once murmured in solitude: sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The wind whistled through the halls, carrying those words through every generation that passed beneath them. Some cadets would stop there before their first missions. Some would return years later, broken, seeking perspective. And all would find the same thing she had offered her whole life: not answers, but understanding. One evening, long after sunset, Admiral Jensen returned to the center. He was old now, slower, but his eyes were still bright with that same quiet reflection she had once shown him. He walked through the halls, his cane tapping softly against the stone, until he reached the wall bearing her words. He stopped there and placed his hand against the cool surface. "Thank you," he whispered. He stayed there for a long time, remembering the simulation room, the elbow, the silence, the lesson that had altered everything. And as the tide rolled in against the rocks outside, the sky above the training center filled with light, an aurora stirred by solar winds, streaking the heavens in quiet color. He smiled through tears. "You were right," he said. "Dignity doesn't speak, it acts." Far from Earth, among the ships she had shaped, her name still lingered. Not as a command, not as a title, but as a way of thinking. When officers paused before making a decision, hesitating, analyzing, considering not just the fight but the consequence, they called it taking a Hayes moment. And in that pause, that heartbeat of restraint before action, her spirit lived on. Because the universe didn't need more loud heroes. It needed calm architects. And Admiral Evelyn Hayes had built an entire generation of them. In the end, her legacy was not a story to be told, but a silence to be understood. And that respect isn't commanded, it's earned quietly, through what you do when no one's watching. He let the words linger in the air. No one clapped, no one moved. They didn't need to. The silence said more than applause ever could. After the crowd dispersed, Jensen remained there for a while, alone in the empty atrium. The late sun filtered through the glass ceiling, scattering gold across the marble floor. The console stood at the center like an altar, the faint reflection of his older face shining back at him. He thought about how far they had all come, the Navy, the fleet himself. Every lesson had begun with her silence. Every victory had been born from what she hadn't said. He walked forward slowly, his boots echoing in the hall. When he reached the velvet rope, he stopped and bowed his head just slightly. "You never needed anyone to know your name," he whispered, "but we all do." Then he smiled. "You changed us." That night the sky above the academy was clear. Students gathered outside, looking up at the stars, an unspoken ritual whenever a legend passed. The constellations shimmered against the black, each one a quiet reminder of how small they were and how great they could become. Up in orbit, the fleet performed a final gesture, a maneuver no one ordered, no ceremony announced. Across hundreds of ships, lights dimmed to half power. Engines slowed. The entire Navy went quiet for one full minute. It was the last salute to the architect. And then, in perfect synchronization, every vessel reignited its engines, not roaring, not thundering, but with the low, steady hum of discipline, the sound of purpose, the sound of legacy. Years later, a new generation of officers studied at the academy built on the coast. They never met her, never heard her voice, yet her presence filled every corridor. Instructors quoted her without realizing it. The textbooks she had authored under pseudonyms were required reading. Her simulations, rewritten and renamed, were still the hardest tests to pass. Cadets spoke of the Hayes Standard, a philosophy that demanded patience, empathy, and accuracy under pressure. They learned that brilliance wasn't measured by speed, but by precision. They learned that leadership meant listening before acting. In time, they stopped saying the architect like a title. They said it like a belief. One of those cadets, a young ensign named Maradine, would one day command a rescue operation that saved hundreds of lives in an asteroid collision zone. When asked afterward how she'd kept calm amid the chaos, she only shrugged. "I remembered what they taught us," she said, "that the loudest room doesn't always have the right answers." Reporters called her words poetic. Those who knew the old stories just smiled. Back in Maine, long after the world had moved on, Evelyn Hayes's cottage still stood. The Navy maintained it quietly, restored and preserved as a historical site. The walls were bare except for a single frame hanging above her desk. Inside it, beneath glass polished to a perfect sheen, was her handwritten note. "Power is the art of restraint. Wisdom is knowing when to stay silent." Visitors would come and stand before it, listening to the faint hum of the sea beyond the window, and somehow, they always left speaking a little softer. Admiral Jensen visited the cottage one last time before his own retirement. The caretaker greeted him, surprised but respectful. He waved away any formality. "Just for a minute," he said. He entered the study, the air thick with memory. Dust motes drifted through sunbeams, and the smell of salt and paper filled the room. The chair she'd used still sat by the window, angled just enough to face the horizon. He sat there and looked out at the water. It was calm, endless, gray, just like her eyes had been. He thought about their strange, intertwined journey, how her silence had become his salvation, how the lesson he'd learned through humiliation had turned into a lifetime of understanding. "Thank you," he said softly. The wind answered, stirring the curtain, carrying the scent of the ocean through the room. He smiled faintly, whispering, "You never stopped teaching, did you?" When he died a few years later, the Navy placed his ashes beside hers in the Academy's memorial garden. No statue marked the spot, only a smooth stone with an inscription carved so shallow it almost disappeared under sunlight. Architect and student, proof that silence can change the world. Students still walk that path. Some stop to touch the stone, to feel the engraving beneath their fingers. They don't always understand it, but one day, when command finds them and the weight of leadership presses down, they will. They'll remember that story, the one about the quiet woman who rewrote the definition of strength, and the man who learned from her in the hardest way possible. They'll remember that sometimes silence isn't absence. It's presence at its most powerful. And somewhere out there in the hum of the fleet, under the endless spread of stars, the spirit of Evelyn Hayes endures, not in ceremony, not in sound, but in the heartbeat of those who choose to lead with calm, with clarity, with purpose. The architect remains, not in title or memory, but in motion. Because she was never just a commander. She was the stillness that made all movement meaningful. And in that stillness, her legacy lives forever. Donims were required reading. Her simulations, rewritten, modernized, renamed, were still the hardest to pass. And still her words hung in the air like oxygen, unseen, vital, and everywhere. Every officer who walked those halls, every cadet who sat in that silent lecture theater, carried a piece of her in them. Not her story, her standard. The Hayes Standard. One evening, decades after her passing, a storm swept across the coastline. The waves battered the cliffs near the academy, wind howling through the empty quads. Inside, a young cadet sat alone in the old simulation chamber, the same one where, long ago, silence had once defeated arrogance. The holographic systems had long been replaced with Neuralink projectors. The consoles were newer, sleeker, smarter. But one corner of the room remained untouched. The old velvet rope. The aged monitor. And above it, that faded photo of a woman with calm eyes and a faint red mark on her cheek. The cadet had heard the story 100 times. But tonight, she needed to feel it. She had failed her final command assessment that morning, panicked in front of her crew, barked orders, lost control. She was certain her career was over. So she came here, to the place where calm had once saved a fleet. She sat on the floor beside the console and whispered into the dark. "What would you have done?" The question echoed, unanswered. But after a while, she noticed the hum of the storm easing. The air felt still. And somehow that silence spoke to her. She closed her eyes and began to breathe differently, slower, deeper, steadier. The memory of her failure replayed in her mind, but she watched it this time without fear. She saw what she'd done wrong. Not in the tactics, in the tone, in the noise. And in that moment, she understood what all those stories had been trying to say. Leadership wasn't about knowing everything. It was about being still enough to see clearly. When she rose to her feet, the plaque beneath the photograph glimmered softly in the light of the emergency lamp. Precision. She saluted it just once and left the room. Her name was Commander Arya Vance. Years later, she would be remembered as the youngest captain ever to receive the Hayes citation, a commendation awarded to officers who demonstrated calm command under catastrophic pressure. Her first citation report read, "For maintaining composure and protecting her crew during the collapse of the ecliptic gate, Captain Vance applied complete system silence and gravitational drift to survive the implosion field, directly referencing archival Hayes doctrine, Class IV." The report ended with a single line. Legacy is not sound, it's motion in silence. The Navy changed again. Ships became faster. Wars became stranger. But the heart of command, the code Hayes had etched into its very culture, never faded. Even as AI co-pilots and orbital drones replaced human tacticians, the systems were still trained on her philosophy. The ARCHITECT algorithm, they called it, an adaptive decision model based on her simulations. Every time an autonomous ship paused before choosing a target, every time a machine learned to wait one fraction of a second longer to verify a threat, it was her hand, her silence, guiding it. She had outlived time itself. In the archives beneath the War College, the final section of the Hayes collection remained sealed, classified, untouched. Until one day, a message appeared in the digital log, anonymous, unsigned. "For those who think silence is weakness, open this file." Inside, there was only one document. Her handwriting. Her final entry. "I was never trying to prove that quiet people are strong. I was trying to remind the loud ones that strength already speaks without them. Noise is temporary, precision is forever." It was dated 2 weeks before her death. Centuries from now, when fleets drift between new stars and old worlds, the training modules will still begin with her words. A soft female voice, synthetic now, but modeled after the fragments of her recordings, will whisper to every new officer before their first simulation. "Remember, the universe doesn't reward noise. It rewards understanding." And somewhere deep in the system's hidden core, the file tag will read, "Architect Protocol, HAYES.ORIGIN." The screen will fade to black, and then in silence the lesson will begin. Far beyond the reach of any fleet, in the endless dark between stars, there's a kind of quiet that feels almost sacred. No voices, no signals, no movement. Only the echo of what people once believed in. In that infinite calm, if one could listen closely enough, past time, past history, past memory, they might almost hear her voice again. Calm, steady, certain. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in that eternal stillness, the architect remains. Not in sound, not in title, but in every act of quiet courage that keeps the human spirit alive. Her silence built a legacy the universe will never forget. And in that silence, her story finally rests.